Hello and welcome. This is Kyle, aka AlienTude, here with a review of a TomKin Type 16 longsword paired with a scabbard by Huerta. In case you're new to my channel, let me introduce myself first. I'm a sword collecting enthusiast with very little training in their use. While I've recently started taking some HEMA classes, I'm still extremely new to it. I also don't have any training in blacksmithing, nor am I a historian. I'm simply a geek who likes to collect functional swords and talk about them. If that interests you, please consider subscribing to my channel. Anyways, onto this sword. I bought the sword and scabbard combo from Age of Chivalry for $1,295 US. It was actually listed on the Sword Buyer's Guide forums for as low as $1,000 last year, but it didn't sell there. I suppose the owner at that time sold it to Age of Chivalry, where it sat for several months before I bought it. This sword was hand-forged by TomKin, owner and soulsmith of TomKin Forge. I had a chance to chat with Mr. Kinder about this sword before doing this review, and I found him to be extremely pleasant and very willing to answer any questions I had. In addition, he is an admin of the Facebook group All Swords, where he is quite active in the community and extremely helpful and willing to share information about both the craft and the business side of blacksmithing. All in all, Mr. Kinder seems to be one of the good guys. I say all this so you know my opinion of him before I get into the details of the sword. If you feel I'm biased, at least you know ahead of time. Mr. Kinder made this sword around 2015 or 2016 during a 7-day class with Howard Clark and Rick Furrer. It was the first longsword he'd ever forged, and only the third sword overall. These days, he's commented that he mostly works on falchions and messers, but that's not particularly by choice. That's what most people tend to commission from him. It sounds like he'd love to work on this type of sword again. This sword is intended as a representation of an oakshot Type 16A sword. This type of sword was primarily in use during the early 14th century. Due to the developing reinforced mail armor of the time, swords started shifting their focus from cutting to thrusting, and Type 16A longswords were designed to be excellent thrusting weapons while still maintaining good authority in the cut. This can be contrasted to Type 17 swords, developed around the time of complete plate armor, which were designed as stout thrusting swords with a minimal amount of focus on the cut. Let's take a look at each part of this longsword, starting with the pommel, which is a classic example of a Type T, also known as a scent stopper. It's made of antique wrought iron, and at first glance you might think it's rusted and damaged, but that's not the case. These beautiful patterns of the wrought iron are one of the things that really drew me to this sword when I was browsing Age of Chivalry. The lines of the pommel are straight and clean, although there are some wobbles to them near the peen, which is nicely shaped without being perfect. All the edges are chamfered, nothing bites into my hand at all, and the pommel is comfortable to grip with the offhand. The grip is made of poplar. It's wrapped in cotton cord and glued together. Mr. Kinder originally put high-quality goat leather on the grip, but it was rewrapped by Mr. Huerta, who also made the scabbard. He wrapped the grip in veg-tanned leather, and while the leather was still wet, tightly wrapped it in linen cord to imprint the corded texture. After the grip dried, the outer wrap of cord is removed. The leather feels great in the hand. It's some of the best feeling leather I've handled for a grip, and the seam is clean and not at all noticeable by touch. I like the color that Mr. Huerta dyed it, a somewhat brighter version of oxblood. The transitions from the grip to the pommel and to the crossguard are incredibly well done. It's very clean and tight. It's just excellent leather work here. The overall shape of the grip is great. The top portion is an hourglass profile with a rounded rectangular cross-section, and the bottom is a wasted shape that transitions from elliptical near the center to cylindrical at the bottom. I love this overall design of grip, as I think it feels amazing in the hand and makes indexing the blade a breeze. I do find this one to be a touch on the large side though. The hourglass is a little broader than I'd like, but this is a very minor complaint. It didn't have any effect on the use of the sword. It just looks a little large and slightly out of proportion to the pommel. Moving on to the crossguard, which like the pommel is made of antique wrought iron. The patterns of the metal here are even more eye-catching than the pommel, and they really give the sword a unique look and feel. The shape is representative of a Type 6 crossguard, with the only embellishment a groove in the center. More on that in a moment. The thickness of the guard tapers nicely from the center to the tips of the quillins, which is something many budget sword makers get wrong. It's easy to look at the profile of a sword and not understand the three-dimensional depth of the guard, leading to some sword makers producing thick, clunky crossguards that don't really reflect how historical swords were made. The fit of the blade to the crossguard is decent, but not great. When you look at top-end production swords from companies such as Albion and Valiant Armory, you'll typically find very tight fits of the blade to the guard, with very little, if any, gap. That gap isn't egregious here. I've seen far worse, and this doesn't really affect the sword in any way other than aesthetics. Still, it would have been nice if the fit could have been a bit tighter. Coming back to that groove in the center of the crossguard, a lot of techniques in the school of HEMA I'm learning call for placing the thumb on the blade to help support it, and the groove makes this easier and more comfortable. I asked Mr. Kinder if this was intended and he said no. He was echoing the fuller of the blade to create a cohesive look. So that turned out to be a happy coincidence for me. I wish I could show you video of how this looks when I use it, but I recently injured my elbow and holding a sword in any of these positions hurts, so I'm trying to let it heal. In any case, the rest of the crossguard is also comfortable to use. I don't feel any uncomfortable edges or hot spots when using the sword. Looking at the scabbard, the wood core is made of poplar, like the grip. Both the leather of the scabbard and belt are veg-tanned leather, hand-dyed by Mr. Huerta. I like the rich red of the scabbard, and the leather feels of great quality. The belt in particular feels thicker, more supple, and just overall higher quality than a lot of belts included with scabbards. The fit of the blade to the scabbard is perfect when the sword is inserted one way, and good the other way, which is probably a function of the sword not being perfectly symmetrical. Even when it's inserted in the less good way, there's very little rattle, and the sword will slowly slide out when held upside down. When inserted the right way, there's no rattle whatsoever, and the sword doesn't budge when held upside down, but it still doesn't require much force to draw. Time to talk about the business end, the blade. Here's the measurements I've taken of the sword. As you can see, the blade distally tapers approximately 0.5 millimeter every 6 inches, eventually ending in a very acute tip. The cross-section of the blade after the fuller is a flattened diamond, with a central ridge that's pretty soft near the fuller before becoming much more refined near the tip. One of the defining characteristics of a Type 16A sword is the long, even profile taper, which this sword nails in my opinion. The fullers run about 13 inches, terminating gradually on one side and a little more abruptly on the other. There's about 1/2 inch of difference in where they terminate on the blade. These kind of small asymmetries are not uncommon in hand-forged swords, and they don't bother me, although some people would find them infuriating. Keeping with those themes, the central ridge after the fuller is not particularly straight. It wavers a little here and there, although as it nears the tip it becomes straighter and more refined. The planes of the sword show a lot of rippling, especially in the fullers. These are leftovers from either hammering or from the grinding process. They don't affect the performance of the sword, and it's not an uncommon sight on swords, but it's always nice when a smith is able to take the time to even them out. Since this sword was created during a 7-day class, I'm not surprised by the rippling. The issues I've brought up until now have been purely aesthetics, but looking down the blade's edge, it looks like there's a slight warp of the edge towards the tip. It's very difficult to detect. I only noticed it after studying the geometry of the blade while looking down the edge, and I'm not sure you'll be able to see it on camera. This is the first issue I've noticed that could potentially affect the performance of the sword, although it didn't seem to do so for me. Still, it's always disappointing to see a warp in a blade. The sword has passed through several owners' hands, and I don't think it's been resharpened. The edge has a very unique look and shape to it. It's a very prominent secondary bevel, which Mr. Kinder seems to have put more polish into than the satin of the rest of the blade. I've heard Matthew Jensen refer to this as a tamon, a wordplay on the hamon of Japanese swords. Judging by that description, this type of edge is very typical of a TomKin blade. It's a convex edge with a lot of meat behind it, so it should be quite durable. So talking about the edge naturally brings me to cutting performance. Please keep in mind that I'm a novice when it comes to using a sword, and my technique is what could only charitably be called a work in progress. Any failed cuts you might see are far more likely to be my fault than the blade's. First, let me talk about the handling of this sword. It feels great in the hand. I was connected to the blade at all times. I knew where it was easy to index the edge, and I had plenty of control over the tip. I've heard that Mr. Kinder learned a lot about making swords from Angus trim, which makes a lot of sense when you consider how well the sword handles, and how well it handles the vibrations from cutting. Before my elbow injury, I was able to record some footage of cutting water bottles, but not pool noodles. Cutting these simple targets was easy and fun. I didn't have any clunkers of cuts where I just batted the bottle aside, and generally speaking they were quite clean cuts. I managed to get 2 cuts on a milk jug, which was a nice surprise. Usually I'm not good enough at this to do so. Now it's time to talk bottom line. Was this sword and scabbard worth the $1,300 price tag? Some people are going to be turned off by the hand-forged nature of this sword. There's a lot of people that expect superb symmetry and fit and finish on swords in this price range. I can't say I blame them. If you wanted a Type 16A longsword, you could get an Albion Cressy for $880 US, and would most likely be more refined. Mr. Huerta's scabbards typically cost in the $400 to $500 range, so you could probably get a brand new Albion and scabbard for the same price I paid for this one. While I definitely appreciate the Albion style of blade, look no further than the Albion Prince I reviewed 2 weeks ago, I also really appreciate the hand-forged nature of this longsword. There's a lot of character and story in this blade, and it feels like it's authentic to the style of actual medieval swords. They too had asymmetries and were not perfect. People in the Middle Ages didn't necessarily have the same appreciation for symmetry that our culture does now. The warp in the blade is definitely the biggest problem. It's certainly less than ideal to have the sword be anything but perfectly straight. However, the warp is minor enough that I don't think it's actually affecting the performance of the blade at all. So that's a long-winded way of saying that for me, I do think this sword was worth the price, but it's totally understandable if other people wouldn't. As for the scabbard, I'm very impressed by Mr. Huerta's work. I'm currently on his waitlist for a scabbard for an Albion Reeve, and after seeing his work on this one, I can't wait to see what he makes for that blade. The leather wrap he did on this grip is excellent as well. Okay, I think I've rambled enough. I want to take a moment to thank both Mr. Kinder and Mr. Huerta for answering my questions. They were both extremely pleasant to chat with, and I hope the information they provided helped to improve this review. And thank you for watching. If you happen to enjoy the review, please give it a like, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider subscribing. Until next time, Alien Toot out.